Prime Minister Narendra Modi is coming on a 3-day landmark visit to the United States of America. There'll be a Quad summit in Delaware, which is the hometown of US President Joe Biden. There'll be the UNGA, the Summit of the Future, which is being held, and the Prime Minister will also be holding a big community event in New York. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Richard M. Rossow. He's the Senior Advisor and Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at the CSIS. Mr. Rossow, thank you so much for joining us on CNN News 18. My first question to you would be about the Quad Summit. The Quad was formed so that the four major Indo-Pacific maritime democracies could better coordinate and align their efforts to strengthen the region. Has it happened? As we see President Joe Biden host the 6th Quad Summit in his hometown, we're also hearing that Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi could have a substantive meeting separately on the sidelines of the Quad Summit.
Yeah, the Quad, I think it's still relatively nascent. I think that the real outcomes that we're going to see are still, going to take some time to gestate. Two primary areas that I look at where the Quad hopes to play a significant role. The first is we want to create closed ecosystems of close partners for trying to combat, I think, China's domination of the production of a lot of areas of strategic technology. And so sometimes India's brain power, American resources, Japan's technology advantage, Australia, of course, also has critical minerals. There's a lot of natural complementarities that we can do to try to make sure that the world has alternative supply chains for a lot of critical technologies. The second area is providing goods across the Indo-Pacific to developing countries. There we had one big opportunity, which was trying to develop a vaccine for COVID. I think that process moved a little bit slow, but it was the first time. And I think as other crises happen, I think the Quad members are going to be able to work together to collaborate to try to provide benefits to other nations across the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's still a little bit early to say, whether it's been a success or not. It's a new kind of a thing with partners, especially India and the others that haven't had a long history of working together. So these kind of summits are important to move the needle forward and find areas of complementarity and cooperation.
How do you see India's growing role in the Quad? We know India made a lot of efforts to hold the Quad in India this time because it was our turn. But now, since it is being held in the US and India will hold it in 2025, how do you see India's role in the Quad? I would say the growing influence and role in the Quad mechanism.
It's the most interesting in a lot of ways of the four partners, because of course the United States has overt security treaties with the other two partners. The level of military interoperability that we have is far beyond. And so I think India being at the table and the fact that it isn't a military alliance has really helped to influence the fact that some of these areas that I mentioned before on cooperating on the development of strategic technologies together, on providing development assistance across the region, a lot of that is probably reflective of the fact that, with the different nature of the relationship with India, these are the first and easiest ways to move into. And if successful, will provide real meaningful opportunities for the rest of the region there. So I think India, in some ways, has been a very defining member of the Quad in that we just didn't have the same depth of relationship they did with the other partners there. And I think the Quad, in some ways, is reflective of India's interest, at least as much as it is the other members.
Mr. Rossow, India under Mr. Narendra Modi also wants to be like the manufacturing hub of the world. That has been a major, priority for Mr. Modi. How do you see the Quad is helping in that? And do you think India-US relations have strengthened to that extent that India's aim of becoming the manufacturing hub of the world can be realized?
I think so far, a lot more of the tangible outcomes have come from the U.S.-India bilateral relationship directly. Think back to last year's joint statement, the White House visit, and all the great pomp and circumstance. But if you look at the joint statement, here is a time when the United States is trying to reshore a lot of manufacturing investment back in our home country. The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, where we're looking to get semiconductors and manufacturing related to energy transitions back onshore in the United States. And yet, uniquely for India, there really aren't that many other countries, if any, where the United States is actively supporting American firms to consider making outbound investments. So when you look at last year's joint statement and you see announcements of semiconductors in areas like this, that is really unique. And I don't think there's any other country that can claim, that pride of place that the United States has for this concept we call friendshoring. A lot of countries hear the word friendshoring and they wonder what the heck it means. India, I think, has got practical experience. But again, that's on the bilateral front. You asked about the Quad. The Quad, again, I think is going to take a bit more time to gestate. You have this Quad Investors Network. Carl Mehta, who's based in California, is actively trying to pull together investors to look at some of the strategic areas where maybe guided by our national security establishments, companies would be willing to take investments and risks that otherwise, you look at the dollars and cents on the paper may not make a lot of sense. But if these four countries agree that unlocking a new country as a source of critical minerals, another country that can do semiconductor production, if these four countries agree that certain markets have competitive advantages, the private sector to follow suit could be really meaningful. So the bilateral, I think, has been the real punch on making India support. The Quad promises opportunity, and I think the Quad Investor Network is the channel to be able to do it.
Very interesting, Mr. Rossow. Also, the one country which is not in the room in Quad, but I would say it is the elephant in the room, is China. How would you explain the China factor in the entire Quad dynamic, especially its relations with India at the moment?
Well, it remains the main strategic competitor across the region for all the Quad partners. So you're right. Even if it's not there, it's definitely there. And it involves a lot of our thinking and really kind of drives some of the areas we're looking to cooperate. When I talk about the Quad coming together to deliver benefits across the Indo-Pacific, some of that is the fact that China has been able to move very fast on infrastructure development, on their own vaccine they developed, and going with countries across the region, trying to win favor. When you think about, again, China's ability to utilize its dominant position on critical minerals, on strategic technology as a hook on foreign policy, we need to make sure that whatever tools China has to show domination over other countries in the region, that gets defanged as quickly as possible. And hopefully these four countries can do things that all of them individually could not.
Mr. Rossow, Mr. Narendra Modi is coming to the US after winning a historic third term. And he's coming at a time when you're also heading in the US presidential elections. It's a very crucial time. How do you see the visit politically? Mr. Modi coming here, he's having a meeting with Mr. Biden. There are reports that Donald Trump has said that he also wants to meet Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. How do you see these political dynamics?
In a lot of ways, this is a stunning, not just trip, but actually series of engagements. You just had the Raksha Mantri, the defense minister in Washington. The U.S. National Security Advisor was in India. The Deputy Secretary of State was just in India, along with Climate Advisor and others. Then just a couple of weeks out, Piyush Goyal is likely expected to come to Washington for a meeting of the Commercial Dialogue and CEO Forum. The finance minister is expected to come to Washington just after that. I mean, to think about this pace of cabinet level meetings happening just a few months before the US national election, if nothing else, it really does show, and it shows that India believes the bipartisan nature of the relationship. It doesn't matter who wins in November. There will be some nuanced changes, and we can talk about those. But, we saw it during the Trump administration. We saw it during the Biden administration. We saw it during the Obama administration. India had pride of place as one of our most valuable emerging strategic partners. Certainly, it's not to the level of depth of interoperability on military that we have with NATO and Japan and others. But you look at the progression of this relationship, security, economic ties over the last 20 years, I think it shows confidence that it doesn't matter who in the United States wins the election. India's got a lot on the table right now to create jobs, to bring in manufacturing. It's the only major trading partner that India has a goods trading surplus. The impact of IT services. So yeah, this is quite a run of senior level engagements, considering we have an election coming up.
So, Mr. Rossow, my last question would be that who do you think has the edge in the US presidential elections? Who would be better for India? Maybe Mr. Trump or Harris?
Yeah, I don't want to make predictions on elections because even the people that do it professionally are more often wrong than not these days. But I think there will be some nuanced differences between what would happen between the two. With Trump, we obviously have in the recent review mirror, defense relations continue to progress and soar. The Quad was elevated up to a cabinet level, and of course, Biden took it to a leaders level summit. So I think military cooperation, interoperability will remain very high on the U.S.-India agenda. I don't think you're going to see a lot of change in that should President Trump come back to office. I think that and I think the same is true for Vice President Harris if she wins. The bigger divergence, I think, is going to be on the economic relationship. What I mentioned before, last year's joint statement, cheerleading American companies' outbound investments to India. I think under President Trump, who's a little more concerned about countries where we have trade deficits, and India is part of that. India is one of our 10 largest trade partners, and the United States has a 2-to-1 trade deficit. So I suspect this outbound encouragement investment with India will probably come down a little bit. Because you recall, during the Trump administration, we had a medium intensity trade war. The United States revoked GSP preferences. India got hit by steel and aluminum tariffs. They initiated countervailing duties. So I think trade gets a little bit more tense. But overall, we saw the leaders, even during that trade fight, have a good person-to-person relationship. Yeah, I expect India knows a lot of good things on the table, no matter who wins.
Thank you, Mr. Rossow, so much for this very enlightening conversation on the Quad Summit. We look forward to touching base again with you on CNN News 18. Thank you so much, sir.
Of course.